He arrived with $50 million in a briefcase. She opened the door in jeans and a faded sweater. 20 years had passed since he destroyed her career and stole her future. Now desperate for peace, he was ready to give her everything he owned. His fortune, his reputation, his entire empire. Just to hear 2 words, "I forgive you." But when she finally spoke, he realized he'd made a terrible miscalculation. Some things can't be bought. Some debts can't be paid. And forgiveness? Well, forgiveness works in ways he never imagined. Before we begin this story, tell me, what city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments below. And if you love powerful stories about redemption, guilt, and second chances, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Now let's go back to where it all began. Richard Thornton stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city unfold beneath him like a kingdom forged by his will alone. From this height, the streets looked orderly, predictable, conquered. At 53, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, he embodied everything the business magazines admired. Visionary leadership, relentless ambition, surgical intelligence. His tech empire had reshaped entire industries. His signature carried weight. His wealth insulated him from consequences most people never escaped. And yet, the view no longer inspired him. It pressed in on him, suffocated him. The discomfort had crept in quietly, a tightening in his chest during meetings he'd once dominated with ease. A strange emptiness after applause-filled product launches. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, sleep fractured by memories he had buried beneath decades of success. His therapist labeled it anxiety. His cardiologist adjusted his medication. His wife suggested time away, a retreat somewhere beautiful and far from responsibility. None of them were wrong, but none of them were right. Richard knew exactly what haunted him. Her name was Elena Martinez. 20 years earlier, he'd been 33, sharp-edged and starving for a cent. The tech world rewarded speed, aggression, and a willingness to take what others hesitated to claim. Elena had been a junior analyst, quiet, exceptionally bright, driven by ideas rather than ego. She trusted him, shared her work with him late one night, excitement lighting her face as she explained an algorithm capable of transforming their entire platform. When the promotion came down to just the 2 of them, Richard didn't hesitate. He took her work, presented it as his own, polished it, framed it, sold it with confidence and charisma she didn't yet possess. When Elena confronted him, her voice shaking but resolute, he denied everything. Calmly, convincingly. The senior partners sided with him, the rising star, over a young Latina woman who lacked political capital and hard proof. She was fired for making false accusations. Richard was promoted. That moment became the foundation of his empire. At the time, he told himself it was survival, that someone else would have done the same, that morality was a luxury afforded only to those already at the top. He buried the guilt beneath achievements, bonuses, headlines, and charitable donations. He married well, built a life that looked immaculate from the outside. But Elena's face never left him. Not her anger, there had been none, but the devastation. The way her eyes had hardened into something lifeless as she realized the truth, that the system would protect him, not her. That the future she'd imagined had been quietly erased in a single meeting. That look followed him into success, into marriage, into sleep. 20 years later, it still woke him at 3 in the morning, heart racing, breath shallow, as if that conference room still existed somewhere inside him, unchanged, unresolved. He tried everything to outrun it. Therapy sessions where he intellectualized his behavior. Donations to organizations supporting women in tech. Mentorship programs that made him look redeemed on paper. But guilt, real guilt, didn't respond to logic or money. It sank deeper, tightening around his chest, demanding acknowledgement. 3 months earlier, desperate, he hired a private investigator. It took 2 weeks. Elena Martinez now lived in a small coastal town 400 miles away. She taught high school math, lived alone in a modest house near the ocean. No husband, No children. No visible trace of the brilliance that once threatened his ascent, except in the quiet pride on her face as she helped students understand something difficult. When Richard saw the photos, her graying hair, the lines time and disappointment had etched into her face, the gentle smile she offered classroom that would never know what she'd lost. Something inside him fractured. This wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about reckoning. He had to see her, had to face what he'd done, not to apologize for his own relief, not to rewrite history, but because the silence had become unbearable. The success meant nothing if it was built on a lie that still bled into every corner of his life. For the first time in decades, Richard Thornton understood something terrifying. No amount of power could erase the past. No empire could silence a truth left unspoken. And some debts could only be paid by standing face to face with the person you destroyed. He turned away from the window, the city no longer resembling a kingdom. It looked like a judgment waiting patiently below. Richard made the drive alone, refusing his driver without explanation. He needed the silence, needed the hours of asphalt and motion to steady himself, to prepare for what no amount of success had trained him for. The highway stretched ahead like a timeline running backward, each mile pulling him closer to the moment that had split two lives apart and sent them in opposite directions. He had rehearsed his speech countless times. In the shower, in the car, in sleepless nights staring at the ceiling. Each version sounded inadequate the moment he imagined saying it aloud. "I'm sorry" felt absurdly small. "I was wrong" felt cowardly. How did you apologize for stealing someone's future? For taking an idea, a path, a life that might have been, and building your empire on its bones? The closer he got, the heavier his chest became. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. For the first time in decades, Richard Thornton, who had faced hostile takeovers, congressional hearings, and public scandals without flinching, felt genuinely afraid. The coastal town emerged from the morning fog, as if rising out of memory itself. Quiet, unassuming, houses with peeling paint and handmade mailboxes. A main street lined with local cafes, bookstores, and hardware shops instead of glossy corporate chains. People walked without urgency, greeting one another by name, as though time itself had agreed to slow down here. Richard's Mercedes felt grotesque on these narrow streets. Too polished, too loud. A moving symbol of everything he represented: excess, ambition, extraction. He imagined the car screaming its presence, announcing him as an outsider, an intruder. Elena's house sat 3 blocks from the ocean. A small blue cottage, sun-faded and modest, with white trim that had seen better days. The porch sagged slightly on one side, not neglected but lived in. A garden of wildflowers bloomed freely out front: lavender, daisies, rosemary, untamed and vibrant. Wind chimes made of seashells sang softly in the coastal breeze. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was everything his life was not. Richard parked across the street and sat frozen for nearly 20 minutes. His heart pounded violently, each beat echoing in his ears. His breath came shallow. Through the front window, he saw movement, a figure crossing from one room to another, carrying something, living her life. She was home. In his briefcase rested the solution he had prepared. Legal documents already drafted and notarized. A transfer of assets into her name. $50 million. An amount large enough to rewrite history, to restore what had been stolen, to compensate for decades of loss. He had told himself this was justice, that money could balance the scales. Now, sitting there, it felt grotesque, insulting, as if he were about to commit the same sin again, reducing her pain to a number. His legs felt unsteady as he stepped out of the car. What if she slammed the door in his face? What if she called the police? What if she laughed, a bitter, exhausted laugh, at his arrogance, at his belief that he could buy absolution? Worse still, what if she barely remembered him at all? He walked up the cracked stone path, slowly. The scent of rosemary and salt air filled his lungs. Each step felt like a trespass, like dragging something rotten into a place that had fought hard to remain whole. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound was sharp, too loud, too final. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. Elena stood before him. She was older, undeniably so, but unmistakable. Her hair was mostly gray now, pulled back into a simple braid. Her face bore lines, not bitterness, but time. Reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. She wore jeans and a faded blue sweater, sleeves pushed up casually, like she'd been interrupted mid-morning. For a heartbeat, she didn't recognize him. He saw it, the polite confusion, the slight tilt of her head as she searched his face for context. Then recognition arrived, slow and heavy. Not with shock, not with anger, with resignation. Something settled into her eyes, like a door quietly closing, as if a long unsolved equation had finally resolved itself. "Richard," she said softly. Not a question, not an accusation, just his name, spoken like the answer she'd always known was coming. His throat tightened painfully. "Elena," he managed, his voice cracking despite himself. I need to talk to you. Please." She studied him for a long moment. The powerful man he'd become stood stripped of titles, standing on her porch with nothing but his guilt. Finally, she stepped back. "Come in," she said. And in that simple gesture, Richard understood something terrifying and profound. This meeting wasn't about forgiveness. It was about truth. And once spoken, nothing, no amount of money, power, or control, would ever be the same again. She studied him for a long moment, and under the weight of her silence, Richard felt something unfamiliar and terrifying. Exposed. Not the curated vulnerability he allowed in interviews or therapy sessions, but a raw stripping away of defenses he hadn't even realized he still carried. Did she see the sleepless nights etched into the lines of his face? The shallow breathing, the pills hidden in his bathroom cabinet? The desperation that had driven him 400 miles alone, clinging to the fragile hope that this meeting might finally quiet the screaming inside his chest. He wondered if she could see it all, the invisible empire he'd built not just of money and power, but of guilt, brick by brick, year after year. A monument no one else could see, but one he lived inside every day. "You should come in," she said at last, stepping aside. Her voice wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It carried a quiet finality, as though she had already made peace with the fact that this moment had arrived. The interior of her home mirrored its exterior, simple, orderly, filled with natural light. Sunlight streamed through sheer curtains, illuminating shelves overflowing with books. Math textbooks, paperbacks with dog-eared pages, journals filled with handwritten notes. On the walls hung framed photographs. Elena standing among groups of teenagers, arms slung around shoulders, all smiling in that unguarded way young people do when they feel seen. Stacks of student papers sat neatly on the dining table, each marked with careful red ink, encouraging comments, gentle corrections, good reasoning. "Try again, you're close." Evidence of patience, of care, of a life spent investing in others. Richard's throat tightened painfully. This could have been so much more. Should have been. "Coffee?" Elena asked, already moving toward the kitchen. Yes," he replied, his voice barely steady. "Thank you." She filled the kettle, moved with quiet efficiency, the practiced rhythm of someone comfortable in her space. Richard remained standing in the living room, suddenly acutely aware of his own presence. He felt too large, too polished, too expensive. His tailored suit probably cost more than her monthly salary. His watch alone could cover her rent for a year. The disparity made his stomach churn. "Sit down, Richard," Elena said gently, setting 2 mugs on the small dining table. "You didn't drive all this way to stand in my living room." He obeyed, lowering himself into the chair, wrapping both hands around the mug as if it were an anchor. The ceramic was warm, grounding. Elena sat across from him, composed, her posture relaxed but attentive. She waited. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, not empty, but vast. Like an ocean neither of them knew how to cross. "You know why I'm here," Richard said at last, his voice hoarse. "I can guess," she replied evenly. "But you should say it anyway." The words lodged painfully in his throat. Naming the thing he had spent 2 decades avoiding felt almost unbearable. He swallowed hard. What I did to you, he stopped, exhaled sharply, then tried again. What I took from you. The algorithm. The credit. Your career. Your future. His hands trembled now. He didn't bother hiding it. Elena, he said, his voice breaking. I destroyed your life. The words landed between them, heavy and irrevocable. I spent 20 years telling myself it was justified, he continued, the dam finally breaking. That it was business. That it was survival. That everyone does things like that if they want to win. But I can't lie to myself anymore. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. I wake up every night seeing your face across that conference table. His eyes burned, but he didn't look away. I need, he faltered, shame flooding his expression. I need you to forgive me. Elena lifted her mug, took a slow sip of coffee, her gaze never leaving him. She didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't soften or harden. She simply listened, allowing his confession to exist without rescuing him from it. I know I have no right to ask, Richard rushed on, desperation creeping into his tone. I know sorry isn't enough. I know nothing I say can undo what happened. But I'm here to make it right. I've brought. He reached for his briefcase with trembling hands, opened it, and pulled out the neatly prepared documents. He slid them across the table toward her. This is a transfer of assets, he said. $50 million. No conditions. No expectations. It's yours. Elena glanced down at the papers, but didn't touch them. It should have been yours all along, he continued, his voice cracking under the weight of truth. I took your future and I want to give you. He gestured helplessly, words failing him. I want to give you everything. The room fell silent again. And in that silence, something profound shifted, not in the documents on the table, not in the numbers printed neatly on the page, but in the fragile space between two people bound forever by a single moment of betrayal. Because for the first time since that day 20 years ago, Richard Thornton had stopped trying to justify his sin. And for the first time, Elena Martinez held the power, not over his money, but over his soul. Elena looked at the documents, but didn't touch them. They lay between them on the table, like an accusation. Richard watched her face, desperate for some reaction. Anger, joy, relief, anything. But she remained still, her expression unreadable. 50 million, she repeated softly. That's what you think my forgiveness is worth. No, that's not. Richard stumbled over his words. There's no price on forgiveness. I know that. This is just, it's what I can do. It's how I can try to make things right. Give you back what you lost. What I lost. Elena set down her mug carefully. Tell me, Richard, what do you think I lost? Everything, he said, the word harsh with emotion. Your career. The recognition you deserved. The life you should have had. You were so brilliant, Elena. That algorithm, what you created, it was genius. It should have made you famous, wealthy, respected. Instead, he caught himself, but too late. Instead, I'm a high school teacher in a small town. Elena's voice remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes. Instead, I'm living in this modest house, making a modest salary, living a modest life. I didn't mean it like that, Richard said desperately. You deserved more. You deserved the world. And you gave me one instead. Elena stood, moving to the window. Her back was to him now, her silhouette framed against the morning light. Let me tell you what happened after I was fired, Richard. Because I don't think you know. I don't think you ever asked. Richard's mouth went dry. Elena, I was blacklisted, she continued, her voice steady. Your company made sure of that. No one in the industry would hire me. I had student loans, rent, and suddenly no income and no prospects. I sold my car, moved in with my sister, spent 6 months applying to hundreds of jobs, getting nowhere. I thought about giving up, thought about disappearing entirely. Each word landed like a blow. Richard gripped the edge of the table. But one day, Elena said, turning to face him, I was volunteering at my niece's school, helping with an after-school math program because I needed something, anything, to feel useful. and a kid asked me to explain calculus. And when I did, her whole face lit up. She got it. And she said, "I didn't know math could be beautiful." Elena's expression softened with the memory. That's when I understood something. The career I'd wanted, the recognition, the success. I'd wanted those things because I loved discovering truth, revealing patterns, helping people see the elegant logic underneath chaos. And I could do that as a teacher. Maybe even better than I could have done it in some corner office, racing for patents and profits. Richard stared at her as if the floor beneath his feet had shifted, as though some invisible structure he'd relied on had suddenly collapsed. "You're saying you're happy?" he asked, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "I'm saying I built a different life," Elena replied, returning to the table. She didn't sit immediately. She rested her hands on the back of the chair, grounding herself. "Not the life I imagined when I was 25. Not the life I worked for back then. But a life nonetheless." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Did losing my career hurt?" "Yes. Terribly," she continued. "Did I spend years angry? Bitter? Feeling cheated by a system that rewarded you and erased me? Absolutely. I won't lie to you, Richard. What you did devastated me." Her voice didn't rise, but each word carried weight. "There were nights I couldn't stop crying. Days I could barely get out of bed. I questioned my intelligence, my worth. I wondered if I'd imagined my own abilities. I watched people who knew less than I did rise, while I was left explaining gaps in my resume I couldn't legally or professionally explain." She paused, breathing slowly. "I had no closure, no justice, no acknowledgement, just silence. And I had to rebuild myself from nothing." Richard swallowed hard. "I went back to school," she went on, "at an age where starting over feels humiliating. I took classes with people a decade younger than me. I waited tables at night. I lived in tiny apartments. I doubted myself constantly. And still I kept going." She finally sat down. "And somewhere along the way, something unexpected happened. I found purpose." She gestured toward the stacks of papers, the photos on the wall. "I found meaning in teaching. In watching students who thought they were stupid suddenly realize they weren't. In being the person who saw potential when no one else did. I've changed lives, Richard. Hundreds of them. Maybe not in ways that make headlines or generate billions, but in ways that matter. Real ways." Richard leaned forward, desperation flashing across his face. "But you could have had both," he insisted. "You could have had success and purpose. I took that choice from you." "Yes," Elena said softly. "You did." The simplicity of her agreement cut deeper than anger ever could. "And that was wrong," she continued. "Deeply, fundamentally wrong. There's no reframing it, no justifying it. You stole from me out of ambition and fear, and you let me be destroyed to protect yourself." She held his gaze. "That's the truth. And we don't get to skip over it just because it's uncomfortable." Tears burned in Richard's eyes. "Then let me fix it," he pleaded. "Take the money. Retire. Travel. Or don't. Donate it. Start foundations. Create opportunities for people like you. Just tell me what to do. Please. Tell me how to make this right." Elena folded her hands together slowly. "That's the question, isn't it?" she said. "What actually makes something right?" She nodded toward the documents on the table. "You came here with $50 million, believing you could finally close the account. Balance the books." But Richard, her voice softened, tinged with sadness rather than judgment. "Do you really think forgiveness works like a transaction?" "I don't know," he cried, the words bursting out of him. "I don't know how it works. I just know I can't live like this anymore. I can't carry it." His shoulders began to shake. "I need it to end," he sobbed. "I need to be free." The silence that followed was vast and merciless. Richard wept openly now, stripped of all composure. 20 years of suppressed guilt poured out of him, ugly, raw, uncontrollable. He'd come here expecting negotiation, terms, exchange. He had built his entire life on a single principle. Everything has a price, and anything can be bought if you pay enough. But Elena wasn't negotiating. She simply watched him, with the same steady, dark eyes that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. And for the first time in his life, Richard Thornton was confronting something money could not touch, because the person holding power over him wasn't holding a contract. She was holding the truth. When Richard finally lifted his head, his face wet with tears, Elena was still there. She hadn't turned away, hadn't excused herself, hadn't offered platitudes or rushed to comfort him. She had simply remained, steady, grounded, witnessing his collapse with the same quiet presence she'd shown since the moment he walked through her door. "Do you want to know something?" Elena said softly. Richard swallowed, nodding faintly. "I forgave you 5 years ago." The word struck him, so suddenly his breath caught in his chest. "What?" he whispered. "Not for you," she added gently, before he could misunderstand. "For me." She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table. "Because carrying that anger, that bitterness, that constant sense of injustice, it was poisoning my life. It seeped into everything. My relationships, my teaching, my ability to be present. I was free on the outside, but internally, I was still tied to what you did." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "So I did the work. Therapy, long walks, writing pages I never showed anyone, meditation, prayer, sitting alone with feelings I didn't want to face. It wasn't fast and it wasn't noble. It was exhausting. But eventually I let it go." Richard stared at her, stunned. "I forgave you," she said again, "because I needed to move forward without dragging you behind me like a shadow. I did it so my life could finally belong to me again." His voice trembled. "Then why didn't I feel it? Why didn't anything change?" Elena leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Because forgiveness isn't a transaction, Richard. It's not something I hand to you like a receipt so you can walk away clean. My forgiveness wasn't meant to comfort you. It was meant to heal me." Then she asked quietly, "The real question is, can you forgive yourself?" The words landed like a physical blow. Richard shook his head slowly. "How could I? How can I forgive myself for destroying your career? For taking something you worked for and pretending it was mine?" "The same way I did," Elena said. "By doing the work." She spoke with calm certainty now. "By sitting with the truth of what you did, without excuses, without minimizing it. By accepting that you were capable of causing real harm and not flinching away from that knowledge. And then, by making different choices going forward. Not to earn forgiveness, but because you've genuinely changed." "The money," Richard started weakly. "The money is irrelevant," Elena said firmly, cutting him off. "If you want to donate it, fund scholarships for women in STEM, support whistleblowers, back organizations that hold corporations accountable, do that. Those are good things." She met his eyes. "But they won't absolve you. They won't erase what happened. There is no amount of money that will let you off the hook with yourself." Something inside Richard's chest cracked, not cleanly, not with relief, but jagged and painful. "Then what do I do?" he asked hoarsely. "If I can't fix it, if I can't make it right, what do I do with this?" "You live with it," Elena said simply. "You carry it. You let it change you. You let it inform every decision you make from now on. You stop trying to outrun it or bury it, and you allow it to become part of who you are, the part that makes you more humble, more careful, more aware of how much power you hold over other people's lives." She stood and walked to a nearby bookshelf, pulling down a small, smooth stone. "A student gave me this," she said, holding it out. "It's a worry stone. You rub it with your thumb when you're anxious." She smiled faintly. "She gave it to me because I helped her through her parents' divorce. She told me I made her feel like she wasn't alone." Elena placed the stone gently on the table. "That's my wealth, Richard. Moments like that. Quiet impacts. The knowledge that I mattered to someone when they were hurting." She looked at him one last time, her voice steady but kind. "You can't buy that. You can't shortcut your way to it. You earn it slowly, by showing up, staying present, and doing the uncomfortable, unglamorous work of being human." Richard sat in silence, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. For the first time, he understood. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about transformation. Richard left Elena's house 2 hours later, walking slowly to his car like a man who'd aged decades in a single morning. The legal documents sat on her table untouched. She hadn't refused them exactly. She'd simply said she'd think about what organizations might benefit, might use them to help others. But it was clear the money wasn't for her, would never be for her. As he drove away, he looked back once in his rearview mirror. Elena stood on her porch, watching him go. She raised one hand in a small wave, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledging, bearing witness. Richard had come seeking absolution. He'd found something far more difficult: responsibility. The drive home felt longer, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. He thought about what Elena had said: you live with it. You carry it. You let it change you. He'd spent 20 years trying to outrun his guilt, building bigger, achieving more, hoping that success would somehow justify or erase his sin. But Elena had shown him the truth. There was no erasing it. There was only the choice of what to do with it going forward. He pulled over at a rest stop, sat in his car, and called his lawyer. Instructed him to set up a foundation, anonymous, not in his name, dedicated to supporting people who'd been wronged in corporate settings, who'd had their work stolen, their careers derailed. Then he called his assistant and cleared his schedule for the next month. He needed time to think, to sit with himself, to stop running. That night, in a motel somewhere between Elena's life and his own, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The guilt was still there. It hadn't magically disappeared. But something had shifted. It felt less like chains and more like ballast. Weight he would carry, yes, but weight that might keep him grounded. Weight that might make him more careful about how he moved through the world. He thought about Elena's face when she told him about the student and the worry stone. The peace in her expression. The quiet satisfaction of a life lived with integrity, even after being broken. She'd offered him something far more valuable than forgiveness, a roadmap. Not for erasure, but for transformation. Richard understood now what Elena had known for years. Forgiveness wasn't a gift she could give him in a single moment. It was work he had to do, day by day, choice by choice, for the rest of his life. He had to forgive himself, not by forgetting or minimizing what he'd done, but by becoming someone who would never do it again. Someone who used his power differently. Someone who saw people like Elena, brilliant, vulnerable, trusting, and protected them instead of exploiting them. It would take years, decades maybe. It would require dismantling everything he believed about success, about power, about what made a life meaningful. It would mean sitting with discomfort, with shame, with the knowledge of his capacity for harm. It would mean showing up every day and making different choices, without praise, without credit, without the satisfaction of being absolved. He hadn't been ready for any of this. Not for Elena's quiet dignity. Not for the reality that forgiveness couldn't be bought. Not for the understanding that true change required him to break himself open and rebuild from the inside out. He'd come seeking an end to his suffering. He'd found instead the beginning of his transformation. As dawn broke through the motel window, Richard finally closed his eyes. The guilt was still there. It would always be there. But now it had a purpose. Now it had an aim. Now it could teach him how to be the person he should have been all along, not through one grand gesture, but through 1,000 small choices, made daily for the rest of his life. Elena had given him that. Not forgiveness. Something harder. Something real. The truth that would set him free, not from his guilt, but from his delusion that freedom was possible without first walking through the fire of genuine accountability. He hadn't been ready, but he was beginning. And for the first time in 20 years, that felt like enough.